I had just moved into my new house, a beautiful two-story home in an upscale neighborhood. The place was perfect, exactly what I had envisioned when I first started saving for my dream home. It was a fresh start, a place where I could finally relax and enjoy the rewards of my hard work. The community seemed peaceful, the houses well kept, and the streets clean. Everything looked picture-perfect. But that morning, something shattered the illusion. As I stepped onto my porch with my coffee in hand, ready to enjoy the crisp morning air, my eyes caught a bright red envelope stuck to my front door. My stomach twisted. It wasn't a friendly welcome letter, that much was clear. I pulled it off, unfolding the paper inside with growing curiosity and concern. The words jumped out at me like a slap to the face. Notice of violation, immediate action required. I frowned, scanning through the document. Apparently, I had racked up $3,500 in HOA fines. The offenses? Having my trash bin out 5 minutes too long, using an unapproved shade of beige for my front door, and, this was the best part, parking my own car in my own driveway. I reread the list, half expecting to find a joke hidden somewhere in the fine print. But no, it was real. Annoyance bubbled in my chest. I had barely been here a month, and they were already hitting me with fines? This had to be some mistake. Surely, a simple conversation would clear things up. I folded the letter and walked back inside, already planning my visit to the HOA office. A few hours later, I stood in front of the Homeowners Association office, a small but fancy-looking building at the edge of the neighborhood. The place had an air of self-importance, with its manicured hedges and neatly painted sign. I stepped inside, immediately hit by the scent of stale coffee and the sterile chill of an over-air-conditioned room. Behind a polished wooden desk sat a woman in her 50s, her short bob cut as sharp as her expression. Her nameplate read, Margaret Summers, HOA President. She glanced up from her stack of paperwork, giving me a look that suggested she had already decided I was a nuisance. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone making it clear she didn't actually want to. I placed the violation notice on her desk. "Yeah, I think there's been a mistake. I just moved in, and I got this today. $3,500 in fines? That can't be right." Margaret adjusted her glasses and picked up the letter, skimming it with an expression that barely concealed her satisfaction. "It's correct," she said smoothly. "Our community has strict rules to maintain property values. You've violated multiple policies." I scoffed. "I parked my car in my driveway. How is that a violation?" She set the paper down and folded her hands in front of her. "Driveways are meant for temporary parking only. All vehicles must be inside garages to maintain a uniform appearance. It's in the HOA handbook." I shook my head in disbelief. "And the trash bin thing? It was out for 5 extra minutes after pickup. How is that worth a fine?" Margaret's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Rules are rules, Mr. Carter. If we allow exceptions, the community falls into chaos." I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my temper in check. "I'm willing to follow reasonable rules, but this is ridiculous. There has to be some kind of process to dispute these fines." Margaret gave a practiced sigh, as if dealing with me was exhausting her beyond belief. "You can submit an appeal in writing. It will be reviewed by the board in the next monthly meeting." I narrowed my eyes. "And until then?" "Until then," she said, her smile widening, "the fines remain, and if they are not paid in full by the due date, legal action may be taken." I stared at her, barely believing what I was hearing. This woman was enjoying every second of this. I could tell she thrived on the power the HOA gave her. She wasn't enforcing the rules for the sake of the community. She was doing it because she could. I grabbed the notice from her desk. "Fine. I'll see you at the meeting." Her smirk didn't fade. "Looking forward to it." As I walked out of the office, my irritation turned into determination. I wasn't going to let some overzealous HOA dictator push me around. There had to be a way to fight this. But first, I needed to figure out just how much power Margaret and her board actually had. The next few days were a deep dive into the HOA's policies, financials, and history. I spoke to a few neighbors, and it didn't take long to realize I wasn't alone. Everyone hated Margaret. She ran the HOA like her personal kingdom, handing out fines for the most trivial things. One neighbor had been fined for having excessively bright Christmas lights. Another had received a violation notice because their flower pots weren't HOA-approved colors. People were miserable, but no one had ever managed to stand up to her successfully. That only made me more determined. 2 weeks later, a second red envelope appeared on my door. I opened it with a sinking feeling in my gut. Final notice. Failure to pay will result in legal action, including eviction. I laughed. Actually laughed. The audacity of these people. Evict me? From my own home? I leaned against my doorframe, shaking my head. They had no idea what was coming. I was going to fight back. And when I did, I wasn't just going to stop them from evicting me. I was going to make sure they never had the power to do this to anyone ever again. Margaret had made a mistake by thinking she could intimidate me. This was about more than just some absurd fines now. It was about showing them that they weren't untouchable. I pulled out my laptop and started digging deeper. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. That night, as I sat in my home staring at the eviction notice, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about some ridiculous fines anymore. It wasn't even about me. It was about an entire community being bullied by a group of self-important people who thought they were above everyone else. I had moved here expecting a peaceful life, but instead, I had walked straight into a dictatorship run by a woman who clearly loved nothing more than controlling her little kingdom. That was about to change. I spent hours researching HOA laws, lease agreements, and property rights. If they were threatening to evict me, I needed to understand exactly what authority they had. I started by looking into the HOA's financials, which were, to my surprise, not that difficult to obtain. Public records and a few discreet conversations with frustrated neighbors painted a very interesting picture. Margaret and her board had been running the HOA like a personal cash machine, imposing excessive fines and using the funds to pad their administrative salaries. There were no actual improvements being made to the neighborhood. The HOA wasn't about keeping the community nice. It was about maintaining power and collecting money. As I kept digging, I stumbled upon something that made me stop in my tracks. The entire neighborhood was built on leased land. That meant the HOA wasn't the true authority here. They were renting the land from a private owner who had the final say in many aspects of how the HOA operated. If someone else were to buy that land, they would hold enormous power over the HOA. That was when an idea formed in my mind, one that made me sit back and smile for the first time in weeks. I quickly looked up the current landowner, an elderly man named Richard Lawson. He had inherited the land years ago but had little involvement with the neighborhood beyond collecting lease payments. A few phone calls and an in-person meeting later, I learned something even more valuable. Richard had been trying to sell the land for months but hadn't found the right buyer. The HOA had made an offer, but he had turned it down because, in his words, he couldn't stand Margaret and her antics. The stars had aligned in my favor. I had the money, I had the motivation, and now I had the opportunity. Within a week, the paperwork was finalized. The land beneath the entire neighborhood now belonged to me. The moment I signed the contract, I knew that the game had completely changed. I decided to play it smart. Instead of marching into the HOA office and immediately revealing my ownership, I let things play out a little longer. I wanted to see just how deep their arrogance ran. So I paid my fines, but with a little twist. The check I sent in for the $3,500 had a memo line that read "Donation to HOA Retirement Fund." It was a small jab, but I knew it would drive Margaret insane. 2 days later, I stopped by the HOA office under the pretense of discussing my appeal. Margaret was there, as smug as ever, already assuming she had won. She barely glanced at me before speaking. Here to finally accept the rules, I assume? I smiled. Something like that. Just thought I'd check in on my appeal. She gave a short, fake laugh. Your appeal was denied. We take the rules very seriously. If we allow one person to ignore them, it creates chaos. I nodded, pretending to consider her words. That makes sense. So I assume you follow the rules as well, right? Her eyes narrowed slightly. Of course. The HOA board leads by example. I leaned in just a little, lowering my voice. That's good to hear. Because I'd hate to see what happens if, say, someone was caught bending the rules for personal gain. For the first time, she looked uncertain. What are you implying? I smiled again, but this time, it wasn't friendly. Oh, nothing. Just something to think about. I walked out, leaving her to stew in her own paranoia. The next phase of my plan required timing, and I wanted to make sure Margaret was caught completely off guard. The following week, the HOA held its monthly meeting, the same meeting where my appeal had supposedly been reviewed. I made sure to attend, blending in with the other homeowners. As expected, Margaret ran the meeting like a queen addressing her subjects, dictating new rules, ignoring complaints, and making it clear that she held absolute power. When the floor was open for comments, I stood up. I have a question, I said, keeping my tone light. How exactly does the HOA decide what rules to enforce? Margaret sighed, clearly irritated. The rules are in the HOA guidelines, which every homeowner agrees to when they move in. I nodded. Right. But what if someone owned the land the HOA was leasing? Would they have the authority to change those guidelines? She frowned. That's not how it works. The HOA operates independently. I pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. Actually, that's not entirely true. The HOA leases this land, correct? A murmur spread through the room. Margaret's face hardened. That's irrelevant. I smiled. Not really. Because as of last week, I bought the land. Which means that, according to the lease agreement, I have the final say on how the HOA operates. The room went silent. Margaret's face drained of color as she snatched the papers off the table, scanning them in disbelief. This isn't possible. It is, I said, enjoying every second of the moment. And since I now own the land, I've been reviewing the lease terms. Turns out, I can revise the conditions under which the HOA functions. Which means some changes are coming. She stood up so fast her chair nearly toppled over. You can't just change everything. I shrugged. Actually, I can. And I will. Starting today, HOA fines are suspended. Parking rules? Gone. Trash bin timing restrictions? Gone. Oh, and one more thing. Any future changes will have to go through a community vote. No more unilateral decisions by the board. The room erupted in cheers. Homeowners who had been silent out of fear of retaliation were now openly celebrating. Margaret looked around, realizing that her power was slipping away. This isn't over, she said, her voice shaking with anger. I met her gaze with calm confidence. Oh, I think it is. I walked out of that meeting feeling lighter than I had in weeks. I had taken back control, not just for myself but for every homeowner who had been living under Margaret's rule. But something told me Margaret wasn't the type to back down easily. If she had any cards left to play, I knew she'd use them. The question was, how far was she willing to go? And was she ready for what I had in store for her next? The moment I walked out of that HOA meeting, I could feel the shift in the air. The power dynamic had changed, and everyone knew it. Homeowners who had once feared speaking up were now openly voicing their approval. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive with excitement rather than tension. People smiled at me as I passed, some even stopping to shake my hand or pat my back. I had given them something they hadn't had in a long time, freedom. But I also knew Margaret wasn't going to accept this defeat quietly. A woman like her thrived on control, and I had just torn it away from her. She wasn't done. Not yet. The very next morning, I received an email from the HOA. It was from Margaret, of course. The subject line read, Urgent, Mandatory Board Meeting. I clicked it open and skimmed through the message. She was demanding my immediate attendance at a so-called emergency session of the HOA board to discuss my unauthorized actions. I chuckled to myself. She was already scrambling to regain control. Good. Let her try. When I arrived at the HOA office, Margaret was waiting with the rest of the board members. Most of them looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, avoiding my gaze. But Margaret? She was practically vibrating with barely contained rage. She motioned for me to sit, but I remained standing. You do not have the authority to make changes to HOA policies, she snapped, her voice sharp and commanding. I folded my arms. Actually, I do. The lease agreement gives the landowner the ability to revise HOA operational procedures. And since I am now the landowner, those revisions are legal and binding. She clenched her jaw, flipping through a thick binder of HOA regulations. The HOA functions as an independent governing body within this community. Your interference is in direct violation of our charter. I smiled. That charter is built on a lease. And the lease has terms that I now control. If you'd like to challenge that, feel free to take it to court. Silence filled the room. Margaret's fingers tightened around the binder, her knuckles going white. She knew I was right, but she wasn't ready to admit it. The board members exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the way things were unfolding. Let's be reasonable, one of them finally said, a middle-aged man named Frank. Maybe we can find a compromise. Margaret shot him a glare so fierce that he instantly fell silent. But the damage was done. The fact that someone on her own board was willing to negotiate meant her control was slipping. There is no compromise, I said, my tone firm. The HOA has been abusing its authority for too long. The fines, the ridiculous rules, the constant harassment, it ends now. Margaret stood up abruptly, shoving her chair back with enough force to make it scrape against the floor. You think you can just waltz in here and destroy everything we've built? I tilted my head. You mean the dictatorship you built? Yeah. I do. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I could see the gears turning in her head, working overtime to find a way to regain control. And then, just like that, she forced a smile onto her face. It was a cold, calculated expression, and I knew whatever she was about to say wouldn't be good. Very well, she said smoothly. If you insist on these changes, then I suppose we have no choice but to comply. I narrowed my eyes. That was too easy. But before I could question her further, she turned to the board members. This meeting is adjourned. Something about the way she said it sent a warning signal through my gut. Margaret wasn't giving up. She was planning something, and I needed to find out what. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. Homeowners who had previously supported me began receiving sudden fines in the mail, violations for things that had never been enforced before. Some were hit with noise complaints, others with yard maintenance warnings. One woman was fined for leaving her porch light on past 10 p.m. It was clear Margaret was retaliating, using every trick she had left to intimidate people back into submission. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I started going door to door, reassuring my neighbors that these fines were unenforceable under the new lease terms. I explained their rights, encouraged them to push back, and even offered to help draft letters disputing the fines. Margaret might have been trying to scare them, but I was making sure she failed. Then, just when I thought I had things under control, she pulled her biggest move yet. A letter arrived at my house one morning, delivered by hand instead of the usual mail service. It was a legal notice, signed by Margaret and stamped with the HOA seal. In big, bold letters, it read, "Notice of eviction. You have 30 days to vacate." I exhaled slowly, shaking my head in disbelief. She was really going this far? I immediately called my lawyer, forwarding him the document. Within an hour, he called back, laughing. "This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen," he said. "They have no legal grounds to evict you." I grinned. That's what I thought. This is desperation, he continued. She knows she's losing, and she's throwing out empty threats to see if she can scare you. Well, she picked the wrong person to scare. Armed with my lawyer's reassurance, I decided to have a little fun. I walked straight into the HOA office, eviction notice in hand, and slammed it onto Margaret's desk. Cute trick, I said, leaning forward. But you're not scaring anyone. She didn't flinch. Instead, she folded her hands neatly and smiled. I have every right to enforce HOA regulations. You had every right, I corrected. But as of now, your authority is gone. This eviction notice is nothing more than an empty threat. Her eyes darkened. Are you willing to bet on that? I grinned. Oh, I already have. And I'm about to raise the stakes. I pulled out my own stack of papers and placed them on the desk. As the landowner, I have the right to renegotiate lease terms. And as of today, the HOA lease has been officially amended. Any violations issued under the old terms are now null and void. Margaret's face turned an alarming shade of red. You! Furthermore, I continued, cutting her off, any attempts to enforce previous policies will be considered harassment. Which means if you send out one more fake fine, one more eviction threat, or try to intimidate another homeowner, I will personally make sure legal action is taken against you and this board. She shot up from her seat, but I was already walking toward the door. This isn't over, she hissed behind me. I paused, glancing over my shoulder. Oh, I know. You're going to fight back. You're going to try something else. But I'll be ready. I stepped outside, breathing in the fresh air. The war wasn't over yet, but I had won another battle. Margaret was getting desperate, and desperate people made mistakes. The only question was how far she was willing to go before she realized she was fighting a losing battle. The next few days were quiet, almost too quiet. After the eviction notice stunt failed, Margaret had gone silent. No new fines, no meetings, no sudden changes in policy. For the first time since I had moved in, the neighborhood actually felt peaceful. But I knew better than to believe it was over. Margaret wasn't the type to give up. She was the type to bide her time, waiting for the right moment to strike. And sure enough, her next move came soon enough. One morning, I woke up to find my mailbox stuffed with printed flyers. I pulled one out and read the bold words across the top. New HOA vote, remove the landlord's control. Below that, there was a paragraph filled with dramatic language about how I was a threat to the integrity of the community, how my changes had disrupted the neighborhood's order, and how I was trying to dismantle the very system that kept property values high. The bottom of the flyer announced an emergency meeting where homeowners would be voting on a proposal to reinstate full authority to the HOA board, effectively overriding my influence. I shook my head, almost impressed by the audacity. Margaret had finally figured out her best chance of regaining control, turning the homeowners against me. If she could convince enough people that my reforms were bad for the community, she might just have enough votes to undo everything. And judging by the number of flyers I saw in other people's mailboxes as I walked through the neighborhood, she had wasted no time spreading her message. I spent the rest of the day talking to homeowners, trying to gauge how much damage had been done. Some were firmly on my side, appreciating the freedom they now had from the oppressive rules. But others were hesitant. Margaret had spent years convincing people that strict enforcement was necessary for a well-maintained community, and for some, the sudden change felt chaotic. She had tapped into their fears, making them believe that without the HOA's strict control, the neighborhood would fall apart. That night, I sat in my living room, thinking. Margaret was good at playing the long game, and I had underestimated how much influence she still had over certain homeowners. If this vote went in her favor, she would have the legal backing to undo all of my changes. I couldn't let that happen. If I wanted to keep control, I had to fight this battle not with legal documents, but with persuasion. I had to make people see the truth. The night of the meeting arrived, and the HOA clubhouse was packed. It was the biggest turnout I had seen since I moved in. Homeowners filled the seats, their faces a mixture of curiosity, concern, and tension. Margaret stood at the front, looking pleased with herself. She had clearly spent the past few days rallying support, and she knew she had the advantage. As the meeting started, she took the podium, her voice dripping with the practiced authority of someone used to being in charge. She talked about how the HOA had always been a pillar of the community, how its rules ensured that property values remained high, and how my so-called reforms were leading to chaos. She pointed out things like a homeowner who had painted their front door a bright blue, claiming it was proof that the neighborhood was losing its uniformity. She brought up the fact that someone had left their trash bin out overnight, using it as an example of declining standard. Then she dropped the real bombshell. She claimed that with the HOA losing its authority, home values were already starting to drop, and if things continued down this path, people would start losing money on their investments. That hit a nerve with many homeowners, and I could see some of them nodding in agreement. I let her talk, letting her build up her argument. I knew she was setting the stage for her big moment, the vote. When she was done, she turned to me, giving me a fake smile. And now, I'm sure our so-called landlord has something to say. I stood up, taking my time as I walked to the front. I wasn't going to win by arguing with Margaret directly. That's what she wanted, a shouting match where she could use fear and emotion to turn people against me. Instead, I had to make them think. I started by asking a simple question. How many of you have been fined by the HOA for something that felt unfair? A few hands went up, then more. Then almost the entire room. I nodded. And how many of you ever actually saw improvements to the neighborhood from all that money? Silence. People glanced at each other, murmuring. I continued. 4 years, the HOA collected thousands of dollars in fines. But where did that money go? Not into fixing sidewalk. Not into better security. Not into anything that actually benefited homeowners. It went into administrative costs, salaries, office expenses, and power trips. Margaret scoffed. That money is necessary to keep the community running properly. I turned to her. Really? Then explain why, in all the years you've been running this HOA, not a single major improvement has been made. She opened her mouth but had no real answer. I didn't give her time to recover. I bought this land not to take control away from you, but to give it back to you. To give you the right to make decisions for your own homes without the fear of being fined for things as ridiculous as the color of your front door. Margaret wants you to believe that without the HOA, this neighborhood will fall apart. But the truth is, the HOA only ever benefited the board, not the homeowners. I could see people nodding, their skepticism toward Margaret growing. She knew it too, and I saw the panic flicker in her eyes. She tried one last move, playing her final card. If we don't keep HOA enforcement in place, we risk lowering property values. And that affects all of you. I smiled. Funny you should mention that. Because in the past 2 weeks, property values in this neighborhood have actually gone up by 2%. That got their attention. I had come prepared. I pulled out printed reports showing recent market trends, proving that home values hadn't dropped. In fact, the relaxed restrictions had actually made the area more appealing to potential buyers, increasing demand. Margaret's entire argument crumbled in an instant. The vote was held immediately after, and the results were overwhelming. Margaret lost. The homeowners voted to keep my changes in place, stripping the HOA of most of its enforcement power. It was over. Margaret's face was a mask of disbelief as she watched her empire fall apart. She tried to protest, but no one was listening anymore. People had finally seen through her. The meeting ended, and for the first time in years, homeowners left smiling, talking excitedly about what they could finally do with their homes now that the HOA's grip had been broken. I watched Margaret storm out, her face pale and her fists clenched. She had lost everything she worked so hard to control. But something told me she wasn't done. The problem with people like Margaret was that they never accepted defeat. And as much as I wanted to believe it was truly over, I had a feeling she had one last trick up her sleeve. After the vote was finalized and Margaret's grip on the neighborhood was officially broken, the entire atmosphere of the community changed overnight. The weight that had hung over people's heads for years was finally gone. Homeowners who had been afraid to make even the smallest changes to their properties without fearing fines were now embracing their newfound freedom. Colorful doors started popping up. Driveways that had once been empty out of fear of HOA retaliation were now filled with cars. People were talking to each other more, smiling more. It felt like a neighborhood again, not a prison. But despite the victory, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret wasn't finished. She had been too invested in controlling the HOA, too determined to hold on to power. The way she stormed out of that meeting wasn't the look of someone who accepted defeat. It was the look of someone plotting their next move. I kept an eye out, expecting some sort of last-ditch effort to reclaim her authority, but for a few days, nothing happened. She stayed silent. No emails, no meetings, no legal threat. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, she had finally realized the fight was over. But then, one morning, something strange happened. A moving truck was parked outside Margaret's house. At first, I assumed she was finally leaving. Maybe she had realized she could no longer control the neighborhood, and rather than live in a place where people no longer feared her, she had decided to pack up and start fresh somewhere else. But as I watched the movers carry boxes inside rather than outside, I realized that wasn't the case. She wasn't leaving. She was preparing for something. Curious, I walked over, pretending to be out for a casual stroll. A couple of the movers carried in what looked like filing cabinets, stacks of binders, and office supplies. That was odd. Why would she need all that? Then I spotted something that made me stop in my tracks. A brand new sign leaning against the side of the truck. The words printed across it sent a wave of realization crashing over me. Summers Property Management, ensuring the highest standards of community living. I couldn't help but laugh. Margaret had lost control of the HOA, so now she was trying to reinvent herself as a property manager. It was the only way she could still exert influence over the neighborhood. If she couldn't control people through HOA fines and regulations, she was going to try and control them through contracts and property agreements. It was pathetic, but also impressive in its own way. She truly had no limit when it came to finding ways to insert herself into people's lives. That afternoon, flyers started appearing in mailboxes. Margaret was offering her professional property management services to any homeowner who wanted to maintain the integrity of the neighborhood. She was pitching herself as a consultant, someone who could help ensure homes stayed within a certain standard to protect property values. It was basically a private version of the HOA, except this time she was running it as a business. She couldn't force people to follow her rules anymore, so instead, she was trying to convince them to pay her to enforce them voluntarily. I knew I had to shut it down before it gained traction. I knocked on doors, talked to homeowners, and explained exactly what Margaret was doing. Most of them saw right through her plan and wanted nothing to do with it. They had just been freed from her rule, and the last thing they wanted was to voluntarily give her control again. But there were a few who were hesitant, the same ones who had initially supported her during the HOA vote. She had gotten to them, convincing them that without someone ensuring standards, the neighborhood would eventually decline. Rather than try to argue with them directly, I decided to let Margaret destroy herself. I knew she couldn't help but overstep. It was in her nature. So I waited. And sure enough, within days, she made her first big mistake. One of my neighbors, an older man named Henry, had been tricked into signing up for her so-called management services. Margaret wasted no time in sending him a formal letter demanding that he repaint his house because it was fading and didn't meet the visual standards of the neighborhood. When he refused, she sent another letter, this time with a threat. If he didn't comply, she would report him to the county for exterior home neglect. That was the opening I needed. I called the county myself, pretending to be a concerned citizen asking about property neglect laws. As I expected, there were no regulations requiring homeowners to repaint their homes unless there was structural damage or a legitimate hazard. Margaret had made the entire thing up, using fear to bully people just like she always had. The difference now was that she didn't have the HOA to back her up. She was just a private citizen making baseless threats. The next morning, I printed out the official county housing regulations and went straight to Henry's house. I showed him the documents, proving that Margaret had no authority to make him repaint anything. Then I made sure every homeowner in the neighborhood got a copy. Within hours, word spread like wildfire. People who had been considering her services tore up their contract. Those who had already signed started demanding refunds. Margaret's new business collapsed before it even had a chance to take off. She tried to fight back, of course. Sent out emails claiming I was spreading misinformation and that I was a danger to the community. But no one believed her anymore. Her reputation was beyond repair. The power she had spent years building had completely evaporated, and she had no one to blame but herself. A week later, the moving truck returned. This time, it wasn't bringing anything in. It was taking things out. Margaret was leaving. She had lost. I watched from my porch as she loaded the last of her belongings into her car. For a moment, our eyes met. There was no more rage in her expression, no more smugness. Just bitterness. She had fought as hard as she could, but in the end she had been beaten. She climbed into her car, started the engine, and drove away without a word. The neighborhood celebrated that night. People gathered in yards, sharing drinks and laughter. Someone even set up a small bonfire, and for the first time since I had moved in, it felt like a real community. Without Margaret controlling everything, people were finally able to just live. It wasn't about chaos or losing property values. It was about having the freedom to make their own choices, to enjoy their own homes without fear of fines or threats. As I sat on my porch, watching my neighbors enjoy their hard-earned freedom, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This had started as a fight to protect my own home, but it had become something bigger. I had helped free an entire community from years of unnecessary control, and in the process, I had made a real difference. Margaret was gone. The HOA was powerless. And the neighborhood was finally what it was always meant to be, a place where people could simply be happy. I took a sip of my drink, leaned back in my chair, and smiled. It was over. And for the first time since I moved in, it truly felt like home.